The morning mist hung heavy over the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. 23 years he had served in the Queen's Guard, and in all those years, he had never once moved from his post when duty called. His black boots gleamed like mirrors, his bearskin hat sat perfectly straight, and his rifle was positioned with military precision. Today would be no different, or so he thought. James had grown up in a small village outside Manchester, where his father worked in the coal mines and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. From a young age, he had been fascinated by the stories his grandmother told him about the Royal Guards, those silent sentinels who stood watch over the most important buildings in Britain. She would describe how they remained motionless for hours, no matter what happened around them, protecting the crown and maintaining the dignity of the monarchy. When James turned 18, he enlisted in the British Army, with one goal in mind: to become a member of the Queen's Guard. The training was brutal. Day after day, he practiced standing perfectly still for hours at a time. His instructors would shout at him, try to distract him, even push him gently to see if he would break his stance. James never budged. His determination was legendary among his fellow recruits. The ceremony when he finally received his red tunic was one of the proudest moments of his life. His parents had traveled down from Manchester, tears in their eyes as they watched their son take his oath. His father, a man of few words, simply nodded and said, "You've made us proud, son." His mother couldn't stop crying. Over the years, James had stood guard during countless royal events, state visits, and ceremonial occasions. He had watched prime ministers come and go, seen tourists from around the world pose for pictures near his post, and maintained his composure through everything from thunderstorms to heat waves. Children would try to make him smile. Adults would ask him questions he couldn't answer while on duty, and sometimes people would even try to touch his uniform or hat. Through it all, he remained as still as the stones beneath his feet. His fellow guards respected him deeply. They called him the Rock because nothing could move him once he was in position. Younger guards would ask him for advice, and he would tell them the same thing his first instructor had told him. Remember why you're here. You're not just standing guard over a building, you're protecting something bigger than yourself. You're protecting history, tradition, and the very soul of this nation. James took this responsibility seriously. He had studied the history of every post he had ever been assigned to guard. He knew the stories of the brave men who had stood in these same positions during wars, during times of national crisis, during moments when the very future of the kingdom hung in the balance. When he stood at his post, he felt connected to all of them, part of an unbroken chain of service that stretched back centuries. On this particular morning in late spring, James had been assigned to guard the entrance to the East Terrace Garden, one of the most photographed spots at Windsor Castle. The garden was spectacular this time of year, with roses in full bloom and the ancient oak trees providing a magnificent backdrop for any occasion. It was also one of the favorite spots for royal photography sessions. As James took his position at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, he noticed more activity than usual around the castle grounds. Staff members were rushing about with equipment, security personnel were conducting extra sweeps of the area, and gardeners were making final adjustments to the flower beds. Something special was clearly planned for today. James had learned not to speculate about royal activities. His job was simple: stand guard, protect the area, and maintain the dignity of his position, regardless of what was happening around him. He had done this thousands of times before, and he would do it thousands of times again, God willing. Around 10 o'clock, a convoy of black vehicles pulled up to the castle gates. James watched from the corner of his eye as they were waved through security and made their way toward the East Terrace. He recognized some of the cars as belonging to the royal household, but there were others he didn't recognize, likely belonging to photographers or other staff members. A tall, thin man in an expensive suit got out of one of the vehicles and began directing people toward the garden area. He carried himself with the air of someone important, someone used to having his orders followed without question. Behind him came several people carrying camera equipment, lighting rigs, and other photography gear. "This is perfect," the man was saying as he surveyed the area. "The light is absolutely perfect here, and the background is exactly what we need. This will be magnificent." James remained motionless, but he couldn't help but notice that the photographer kept looking in his direction. The man walked closer, studying James as if he were part of the scenery, which in many ways he was. "Excuse me." The photographer called out. "You there, guard?" James didn't respond. He wasn't supposed to respond. His orders were clear. Maintain position, remain silent, and don't interact with civilians unless there was a direct threat to security. The photographer tried again, this time walking right up to James. "I said, excuse me, I need you to move." Still, James said nothing. His eyes stared straight ahead. His breathing remained steady and controlled, and his grip on his rifle never wavered. The photographer seemed irritated by this response, or lack thereof. "Look, I don't think you understand. I'm setting up for a very important photo shoot here today. The Duchess of Cornwall will be arriving soon, and I need this area cleared. That includes you." James had heard the name. Everyone in Britain knew who the Duchess of Cornwall was. Camilla Parker Bowles had married Prince Charles in 2005, making her second in line to become Queen Consort. She was a member of the royal family, and James had nothing but respect for her position. But that didn't change his orders or his duty. The photographer was getting more agitated now. "Are you listening to me? I'm telling you that you need to move. This is for official royal business." A small crowd was beginning to gather. Other staff members had noticed the confrontation and were watching to see what would happen. James could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't let it affect his stance. He had been in situations like this before, though perhaps not quite so public. "Sir," one of the royal household staff members approached the photographer. "Perhaps I can explain. The guards are not permitted to leave their posts during their duty hours. It's protocol." The photographer turned to face the staff member, his face red with frustration. "Protocol? I don't care about protocol. I have a job to do, and this guard is in my shot. He needs to move, or I'll have to find someone who can make him move." "I'm afraid that's not possible," the staff member replied calmly. "These guards are under military command, not civilian authority. Only their commanding officer can order them to change position. Then get their commanding officer," the photographer snapped. "I don't have time for this nonsense." James remained perfectly still throughout this exchange, but inside, he was thinking about his duty and his oath. He had sworn to protect this post, and that meant staying here regardless of who wanted him to move or why. It wasn't personal. It wasn't about disrespecting anyone. It was about doing his job exactly as he had been trained to do it. The staff member excused himself to make some phone calls, leaving the photographer pacing back and forth in front of James. Other members of the photography crew were setting up equipment around the garden that they kept glancing over at the standoff between their boss and the immovable guard. "You know," the photographer said, speaking directly to James again, "I've worked with royalty all over the world. I've photographed kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers. I've never encountered such stubbornness from a simple guard." James didn't react to the insult. He had been called worse things by people who mattered far less. His commitment to his duty wasn't about pride or stubbornness. It was about something deeper than that. About 20 minutes later, the staff member returned with a man in military dress uniform. James recognized him immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, one of the officers responsible for coordinating the Queen's Guard duties at Windsor Castle. "What seems to be the problem here?" the lieutenant colonel asked. The photographer launched into an explanation of his needs for the photo shoot, emphasizing the importance of the event and the need for the guard to be relocated. He spoke with the confidence of someone who was used to getting his way in these situations. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison listened patiently, then turned to look at James. "Sergeant Mitchell, you have your orders for this post?" "Yes, sir," James replied, speaking for the first time that morning. His voice was clear and strong. "And those orders specify your position and your duties?" "Yes, sir. Guard the East Terrace Garden entrance from 8 o'clock to 16 o'clock hours, sir." "Then you will carry out those orders, Sergeant." The photographer looked shocked. "But you don't understand the importance of this photo shoot. This is for the Duchess herself." "I understand perfectly," the lieutenant colonel replied, "and I also understand the importance of military discipline and following orders. Sergeant Mitchell will remain at his post as assigned." The photographer's face grew even redder. "This is absurd. I'll speak to someone higher up about this. This guard's stubbornness is going to ruin everything. You're certainly free to take up your concerns with whoever you feel appropriate," the lieutenant colonel said calmly. But until I receive different orders from my chain of command, Sergeant Mitchell stays where he is." As the lieutenant colonel walked away, the photographer turned back to James with a look of pure frustration. "You're making a big mistake," he said. "When the Duchess arrives and sees this mess, you're going to be in serious trouble." He had his orders, and he had the support of his commanding officer. That was all he needed. The photographer could threaten him all he wanted, but James knew he was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. Around noon, word spread through the castle staff that the Duchess of Cornwall's arrival was imminent. The photography crew had set up their equipment around James's position, creating somewhat of an awkward arrangement, but they had managed to work around his presence. The photographer had not given up, however. James could see him speaking with various officials, pointing in his direction and making animated gestures. Several times throughout the morning, different people had approached James's post, looked at him thoughtfully, and then walked away without saying anything. James remained focused on his duty. He watched the approaches to the garden, kept track of everyone who came and went, and maintained his military bearing despite the unusual circumstances. This was what he had trained for, even if he had never imagined it would involve standing firm against a photographer's demands. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, James could feel sweat beginning to form under his heavy uniform, but he didn't allow himself to show any discomfort. This was part of being a Queen's Guard. You stood your post regardless of weather, regardless of personal comfort, and regardless of anyone who might want you to do otherwise. The morning had certainly not gone as he had expected when he first took his position, but James felt confident that he was doing the right thing. His duty was clear, his orders were specific, and his commitment to service was unwavering. Whatever happened next, he would face it standing exactly where he belonged, at his post, protecting the East Terrace garden entrance, serving his queen and his country with honor and dignity. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked-about confrontations in recent royal history, though James had no way of knowing that yet. All he knew was that he had a job to do, and he intended to do it properly, no matter who tried to make him do otherwise. At exactly 12:30 in the afternoon, the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard coming up the castle drive. James Mitchell maintained his rigid stance at the East Terrace garden entrance, but he could sense the increased tension in the air around him. Staff members who had been bustling about all morning suddenly moved with more purpose, and security personnel took up their designated positions. The photographer, who had spent the better part of 2 hours complaining to various officials about James's refusal to move, suddenly became all business. He barked orders at his assistants, checked his equipment one final time, and positioned himself where he believed he would get the best shots once the Duchess arrived. "Remember," he called out to his team, "we only get one chance at this. The lighting is perfect right now, but it won't last forever. We need to work quickly and efficiently." James watched as 3 black Range Rovers pulled into view, their windows tinted so dark that it was impossible to see inside. The lead vehicle came to a stop near the garden entrance, and immediately, Royal Protection officers emerged and began their security sweep of the immediate area. One of the protection officers approached James's position. Unlike the photographer, this man understood military protocol and the role of the Queen's Guard. "Sergeant," the officer said quietly, "the Duchess will be exiting the vehicle in approximately 2 minutes. Standard security procedures are in effect. Is there anything you need to report about this area?" "No, sir," James replied, keeping his voice low and professional. "Area is secure. No unusual activity to report." The protection officer nodded and moved on to complete his sweep. This brief interaction reminded James why he took such pride in his role. He wasn't just a ceremonial figure standing motionless for tourists to photograph. He was part of the security apparatus that protected the royal family, and his presence here served a real purpose. The car door opened, and Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, stepped out onto the gravel drive. She was dressed elegantly in a cream-colored coat and matching hat, with a string of pearls that caught the afternoon sunlight. Her smile was warm and genuine as she greeted the waiting staff members. "What a beautiful day," she said, looking around at the garden and the castle beyond. "This is absolutely perfect for photographs." The photographer immediately sprang into action, approaching the Duchess with the confidence of someone who had worked with royalty before. "Your Royal Highness, thank you so much for making time for this session today. I have some wonderful ideas for shots that will really capture the elegance of both yourself and this magnificent setting." The Duchess nodded graciously. I'm entirely in your hands. Where would you like me to start? The photographer gestured toward the garden area, but as he did so, his expression darkened slightly. Well, Your Royal Highness, we do have one small complication. You see that guard over there? He pointed directly at James. He's been standing in that exact spot all morning, and despite numerous requests, he refuses to move. He's going to be directly in the background of several of the shots I had planned. The Duchess followed his gaze to where James stood at perfect attention. For a moment, she simply observed him, taking in his immaculate uniform, his rigid posture, and his unwavering focus on his duties. I see, she said thoughtfully. And you've asked him to move? Several times, the photographer replied, his frustration evident in his voice. I've spoken to him directly. I've had staff members speak to him, and I even had his commanding officer come down here. Everyone seems to think that his duty is more important than this photo session. The Duchess raised an eyebrow at this comment. His duty? One of the royal household staff members stepped forward to explain. Your Royal Highness, Sergeant Mitchell is assigned to guard this entrance as part of the regular security rotation. He's simply following his orders and maintaining his post as he's been trained to do. The photographer scoffed. With all due respect, Your Royal Highness, surely a simple guard can be asked to step aside for something as important as official royal photographs. This is for the crown, after all. The Duchess was quiet for a moment, and James could sense that all eyes were on her, waiting to see how she would handle this situation. He had no idea what she might say or do, but he remained committed to his duty regardless of the outcome. I think, the Duchess said slowly, that perhaps we should work around the sergeant rather than asking him to abandon his post. After all, he's doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing, isn't he? But Your Royal Highness, the compositions I had planned require that area to be clear. Having a guard in the background will completely change the aesthetic of the photographs. Then perhaps, the Duchess replied with a slight smile, we need to be a bit more creative with our compositions. James felt a surge of relief, though he didn't let it show on his face. She grasped the importance of duty and the significance of a soldier following his orders, even when it might be inconvenient for others. The photographer, however, was not ready to give up so easily. Your Royal Highness, I photographed royalty all over the world, and I can assure you that in every other situation, when there was a conflict between duty and practicality, practicality won out. This guard's stubbornness is going to compromise the quality of these photographs. At the word stubbornness, the Duchess's expression shifted slightly. James noticed the change immediately, though he doubted anyone else in the group would have picked up on such a subtle alteration in her demeanor. Stubbornness? The Duchess repeated, her voice taking on a cooler tone. I wouldn't call following orders and maintaining one's post stubbornness. I would call it duty. The photographer, perhaps sensing that he had misspoken, tried to backtrack. Of course, Your Royal Highness. I simply meant that surely there must be some way to arrange for the guard to be temporarily reassigned so that we can get the shots we need. And why, the Duchess asked, should a soldier be moved from his assigned post simply to make a photographer's job easier? James continued to stare straight ahead, but he was following every word of the conversation with intense interest. He had never imagined that a member of the royal family would stand up for him against someone who was supposedly working on their behalf. The photographer was clearly struggling to find an appropriate response. Well, that is to say, I assumed that the photographs would take priority over routine guard duties. Did you? The Duchess replied. And what gave you that impression? Several staff members were now exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. The photographer's assistants had stopped setting up equipment and were watching the exchange with growing concern. I simply thought, the photographer continued, that for something this important, exceptions could be made. The Duchess walked closer to where James stood, studying him with obvious interest. Sergeant, she said, addressing him directly for the first time. Yes, Your Royal Highness, James replied, his voice clear and steady. How long have you been on duty at this post today? Since 800 hours, Your Royal Highness. And when does your duty here end? 1600 hours, Your Royal Highness. The Duchess nodded. And in all that time have you left this post even once? No, Your Royal Highness. Something to eat or drink? No, Your Royal Highness. Those provisions are made during the change of guard. The Duchess turned back to face the photographer, and James could hear a new note of steel in her voice. So you're asking me to order a soldier to abandon his post, to break his oath and ignore his training, simply because you find his presence inconvenient? The photographer was now visibly sweating, despite the pleasant temperature. I wouldn't put it quite like that, Your Royal Highness. Then how would you put it? I would say that I'm asking for practical considerations to take precedence over rigid adherence to protocol. The Duchess was quiet for several long seconds. When she spoke again, her voice was firm and decisive. Well, I'm afraid I disagree with your priorities. She turned to address the gathered staff members. This sergeant is doing his duty exactly as he has been trained to do. He has been assigned to protect this entrance, and he is doing so with honor and dedication. I will not ask him to abandon his post, and I will not tolerate anyone else doing so either. The photographer made one last desperate attempt. But Your Royal Highness, the photographs will be taken around the sergeant's position, the Duchess finished. If you're half as skilled as you claim to be, you should be able to work with the situation as it exists, rather than demanding that reality be altered to suit your convenience. James felt a deep sense of respect for the Duchess in that moment. She could have easily ordered him to move, and he would have had no choice but to comply. Instead, she had chosen to support his duty and his commitment to his orders. The photographer's face had gone through several shades of red during this exchange, and now he looked almost purple with frustration. Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid you don't understand the technical requirements involved in creating the images we need. Then perhaps, the Duchess said with finality, you should spend less time making excuses, and more time figuring out how to do your job properly. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Even the birds in the nearby trees seemed to have stopped singing. The photographer stared at the Duchess in shock, clearly unable to believe that his demands were being so firmly rejected. Finally, one of the household staff members stepped forward to break the tension. Your Royal Highness, perhaps we could begin with some shots in the rose garden area, which would give us excellent natural lighting, while we determine the best way to arrange the remaining photographs. The Duchess smiled warmly at this suggestion. That sounds perfect. Let's begin there and see what develops. As the group moved toward the rose garden, the photographer continued to glance back at James with obvious resentment, but the Duchess had made her position clear, and there would be no further discussion about moving the guard from his post. James remained exactly where he was, maintaining his professional demeanor while internally marveling at what he had just witnessed. The Duchess of Cornwall had not only understood his position, but had actively defended it against someone who was supposed to be working for the royal family. As the photo session began in earnest in the rose garden, James could hear the clicking of cameras and the photographer's increasingly subdued directions to his team. The man had clearly been humbled by his encounter with the Duchess, and his earlier arrogance had been replaced by a more respectful, if somewhat sullen, professionalism. The afternoon sun continued to shine brightly over the East Terrace garden, and James continued to stand guard exactly where he belonged, his faith in the importance of duty and honor strengthened by the unexpected support he had received from one of the very people he had sworn to protect. After the photo session in the rose garden, the Duchess of Cornwall appeared relaxed and pleased with the initial results. She chatted easily with the household staff about the upcoming events in her schedule and made casual observations about the beauty of the Windsor Castle grounds. The photographer, meanwhile, had become notably quieter, speaking only when necessary and keeping his previous arrogance firmly in check. James Mitchell remained at his post, watching the activity around him with the same steady attention he had maintained all morning. The sun was now high overhead, and he could feel the weight of his heavy bearskin hat and the warmth of his thick red tunic. But these physical discomforts were nothing new to him. He had stood guard in far worse conditions than this pleasant spring afternoon. Your Royal Highness, the photographer said, approaching the Duchess with obvious reluctance, I believe we've captured some excellent images in the rose garden. However, I really do think we need to explore some shots closer to the castle walls. The stonework provides such a magnificent backdrop, and the light is particularly favorable in that area right now. The Duchess glanced toward the area he was indicating, which happened to be directly behind where James stood guard. I see. And this would require us to work around Sergeant Mitchell's position? Unfortunately, yes, the photographer admitted. The angles I need for the most dramatic shots would place the guard directly in the frame. I've been thinking about this all afternoon, and I really don't see any way around it. The Duchess looked thoughtful. Have you considered that perhaps having a Queen's Guard in the background might actually enhance the photographs rather than detract from them? After all, they are very much a part of the heritage and tradition of the royal residences. This suggestion clearly hadn't occurred to the photographer, and he looked genuinely surprised by it. Well, that is to say, the brief I was given emphasized elegance and formal beauty. I'm not sure a military figure fits with that aesthetic, doesn't it? The Duchess asked, raising an eyebrow. I would think that the dedication, discipline, and honor represented by the Queen's Guard would be entirely consistent with the values we want to convey. James felt a surge of pride at these words, though he maintained his stoic expression. The Duchess was not only defending his right to remain at his post, but was actually suggesting that his presence might add value to the photographs. This was far beyond what he had expected when the confrontation first began. The photographer, however, seemed increasingly frustrated by the direction of the conversation. Your Royal Highness, with respect, I have significant experience in royal photography, and I can assure you that military personnel are typically kept out of formal portrait sessions unless they are specifically part of the intended composition. And who, the Duchess asked pointedly, decided that military personnel should be kept out of these photographs? Well, it's standard practice in the industry. Most royal photography focuses on the elegance and grace of the subject, without distractions. The word distractions seemed to hang in the air, and James could sense that the Duchess had not missed the implication. Her voice took on a distinctly cooler tone. Are you suggesting, mister? She paused, realizing she had never been properly introduced to the photographer. Whitman, Your Royal Highness. Marcus Whitman. Are you suggesting, Mr. Whitman, that a British soldier doing his duty is a distraction from royal dignity? The photographer realized immediately that he had stepped into dangerous territory. No, Your Royal Highness, of course not. I simply meant that from a compositional standpoint. From a compositional standpoint, the Duchess interrupted. I would think that having a member of the Queen's Guard in the background would reinforce the connection between the royal family and the military forces that have served the crown for centuries. James was amazed by the Duchess's understanding of the deeper significance of his role. Many people saw the Queen's Guard as merely ceremonial, colorful figures who stood around for the benefit of tourists. But the Duchess clearly grasped that they represented something much more important: the unbroken tradition of military service to the crown that stretched back through generations of British history. Mr. Whitman was now looking visibly uncomfortable. Sweat had begun to appear on his forehead, and he kept glancing around as if hoping someone would come to his rescue. Your Royal Highness, I certainly don't want to appear disrespectful to our military traditions. Perhaps we could arrange for the sergeant to be included in 1 or 2 shots specifically designed to showcase that heritage, while keeping him out of the more formal portrait-style images. And why would that be necessary? The Duchess asked. Why should we segregate military service from royal dignity? Are they not intrinsically connected? This question seemed to stump the photographer completely. He opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly struggling to find a response that wouldn't further offend the Duchess while still achieving his goal of removing James from the shots. During this exchange, James noticed that several other staff members had gathered nearby, drawn by the increasingly tense conversation. Word was clearly spreading through the castle staff that something unusual was happening at the East Terrace garden. Some of the newer staff members looked nervous, while the more experienced ones watched with what appeared to be fascination. One of the household staff members, a woman James recognized as being quite senior in the organization, stepped forward tentatively. Your Royal Highness, perhaps I could suggest a compromise. We could arrange for additional guards to be positioned in the area, creating a more formal military presence that would be clearly intentional rather than incidental. The Duchess considered this suggestion for a moment. That's an interesting idea, Patterson. But I'm not sure it addresses the fundamental issue here. Which is? Mrs. Patterson asked. Which is whether a single guard doing his duty should be moved simply because a photographer finds his presence inconvenient. The bluntness of this statement seemed to surprise everyone present, including James. The Duchess was not mincing words or trying to diplomatically avoid the central conflict. She was addressing it head-on, and her position was becoming increasingly clear. Whitman made another attempt. "Your Royal Highness, I think there may be a misunderstanding here. This isn't about the Guard personally, or about disrespecting military service. This is simply about creating the best possible images to represent the royal family. Surely that goal is worth a small adjustment to routine protocols." "Small adjustment?" the Duchess repeated. "You're asking a soldier to abandon his post. You're asking him to ignore his orders, disregard his training, and compromise his duty. In what world is that a small adjustment?" The photographer's face was now noticeably red. "Your Royal Highness, I think you're perhaps overstating the significance of this. It's just a guard post. He could easily be reassigned to another location for a few hours." The moment these words left his mouth, James could sense that Mr. Passion had sensed. Whitman had made a serious error. The Duchess's expression hardened, and when she spoke, her voice carried an unmistakable note of royal authority. "Just a guard post?" she repeated slowly. "Mr. Whitman, do you have any understanding of what this uniform represents? Do you know what it means to be a member of the Queen's Guard?" The photographer seemed to realize that he had crossed a line, but it was too late to take back his words. Of course I understand the importance of—" "No," the Duchess cut him off. "I don't think you do understand. This isn't just a uniform, and this isn't just a guard post. This is a soldier who has taken an oath to serve his queen and his country. He has been given orders, and he is carrying them out with honor and dedication. The fact that his commitment to duty is inconvenient for you does not diminish its importance." James felt deeply moved by the Duchess's words. In his 23 years of service, he had never heard anyone articulate so clearly and forcefully the meaning and significance of what he did every day. The Duchess understood that being a Queen's Guard was not just a job or a role to be performed for public consumption. It was a sacred trust, a commitment that went far beyond mere ceremony. The photographer was now clearly desperate. "Your Royal Highness, please understand that I'm not trying to demean anyone's service. I'm simply trying to do my job effectively. These photographs are important for the royal household's public image and you believe," the Duchess interrupted, "that the royal household's public image would be better served by showing disregard for military duty and discipline?" This question seemed to stop Mr. Whitman cold. He stared at the Duchess for several seconds, apparently trying to process the implications of what she had just said. "Because," the Duchess continued, "that's exactly what we would be doing if we ordered Sergeant Mitchell to abandon his post for the convenience of a photo session. We would be sending the message that duty and honor are less important than appearances, that commitment and discipline can be set aside whenever they become inconvenient." The gathering crowd of staff members was now listening in complete silence. James could sense their attention, but he remained focused on maintaining his military bearing. This conversation was about principles far larger than his individual situation, and he felt honored to be at the center of such a defense of military values. Mr. Whitman made one final desperate attempt. "Your Royal Highness, I assure you that no one would interpret the temporary relocation of a guard as a sign of disrespect for military service. These kinds of accommodations are made all the time for important events." The Duchess looked at him with something approaching contempt. "Mr. Whitman, you seem to be under the impression that I share your priorities. Let me be absolutely clear. I do not. The integrity of military service, the importance of duty, and the honor of keeping one's word are not negotiable commodities to be traded away for better camera angles." The photographer's shoulders sagged in defeat. He had clearly never encountered this level of resistance to what he probably considered a simple, reasonable request. In his world, practical considerations typically trumped abstract principles, and convenience usually won out over tradition. "Now," the Duchess said, her voice returning to a more normal tone but retaining its firm edge, "I suggest you find a way to work with the situation as it exists. If you cannot create satisfactory photographs with Sergeant Mitchell at his post, then perhaps you are not the right photographer for this assignment." This final statement left no room for further argument. Whitman had been given his choice: adapt to the circumstances or face the consequences of failing to complete his assignment. The confrontation had escalated far beyond what anyone had expected, and the Duchess had made her position unmistakably clear. After the Duchess's firm declaration that the photographer would need to work around Sergeant Mitchell's position, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group gathered at the East Terrace garden. Mr. Felicio Whitman stood frozen, clearly struggling to process what had just happened to him. In his professional career, he had never encountered such absolute resistance to what he considered a reasonable request, especially not from someone he was supposed to be serving. The household staff members exchanged glances, unsure how to proceed. Patterson, the senior staff member who had tried to suggest a compromise earlier, looked particularly concerned about the escalating tension. She had worked at Windsor Castle for over 15 years and had never witnessed such a direct confrontation between a member of the royal family and a service provider. James Mitchell remained at perfect attention, but internally he was marveling at the turn of events. What had started as a routine day of guard duty had become something unprecedented in his experience. The Duchess of Cornwall had not only defended his right to remain at his post, but had done so with such conviction and authority that she had essentially ended the photographer's attempts to have him moved. "Well, Mr. Pring," Whitman said finally, his voice strained with barely controlled frustration, "I suppose I'll have to make the best of the situation." The Duchess studied him carefully before responding. "I certainly hope you will." "And Mr. Whitman?" "Yes, Your Royal Highness. I trust that you understand my expectations regarding the tone and approach of the remainder of this session." The photographer nodded stiffly. "Of course, Your Royal Highness." But as the group began to move toward the area near the castle walls where Mr. Whitman wanted to take his next series of photographs, James could see that the man was still seething with resentment. The photographer's jaw was clenched, his movements were sharp and jerky, and he kept shooting dark glances in James's direction. The photo session resumed, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Where before there had been professional efficiency and polite conversation, now there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to affect everyone present. Whitman directed his assistants with curt commands, and his interactions with the Duchess, while superficially respectful, lacked the enthusiasm and deference he had shown earlier. The Duchess, for her part, seemed entirely unaffected by the photographer's mood. She posed gracefully for each shot, made pleasant conversation with the staff members between takes, and even took a moment to admire some of the spring flowers that were blooming in the garden beds nearby. "The roses are particularly beautiful this year," she commented to one of the groundskeepers who happened to be working in the area. "You and your team should be very proud of the work you've done here." The groundskeeper, a middle-aged man who had clearly not expected to be addressed directly by a member of the royal family, stammered out his thanks. "It's been a good year for growing, Your Royal Highness. The weather has been just right for the flowers." James watched this interaction with interest. The contrast between the Duchess's warm, genuine interest in the groundskeeper's work and her cool dismissal of the photographer's demands said something important about her character and her values. She clearly had respect for people who did their jobs well and with pride, regardless of their position in the social hierarchy. As the afternoon wore on, Mr. Job Bocas, Whitman's frustration seemed to be growing rather than diminishing. Several times, James noticed the photographer positioning himself to take shots that would have been improved by having the guard area clear, and each time the man would pause, look toward James with obvious irritation, and then have to adjust his composition to work around the guard's presence. "The light is shifting," Mr. Whitman announced to his team. "We need to work faster if we're going to get the shots we need." "Perhaps," the Duchess suggested mildly, "if you spent less time lamenting the circumstances and more time focusing on your work, you might find the process more efficient." The comment was delivered in such a pleasant tone that it took Mr. E's between faces. Whitman a moment to register the criticism embedded within it. When he did, his face flushed red again. "Your Royal Highness," he said, clearly struggling to keep his voice level, "I am doing my best to work under what I consider to be unnecessarily difficult conditions." "Unnecessarily difficult," the Duchess repeated. "Mr. Biggie, Whitman, you have been granted access to one of the most beautiful and historic locations in Britain. You have perfect weather, excellent natural lighting, and a subject who has been entirely cooperative with your requests. The only thing you don't have is the ability to order a soldier to abandon his duty for your convenience. If that makes your job unnecessarily difficult, then perhaps you should reconsider your profession." This exchange was witnessed by all the staff members present, and James could see the shock on their faces. The Duchess was not merely defending his position anymore. She was actively challenging the photographer's professional competence and attitude. Mr. Whitman's hands were now visibly shaking with anger. "Your Royal Highness, I have photographed royalty on 5 continents. I have worked with kings, queens, emperors, and presidents. Never once have I encountered such obstinacy over what should be a simple accommodation." The word obstinacy seemed to trigger something in the Duchess. Her entire demeanor shifted, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tone that James had never heard before. Not just authority, but something approaching genuine anger. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her words coming slowly and deliberately, "let me explain something to you. You seem to be under the impression that your extensive resume and international experience give you some sort of special authority here. They do not. You also seem to believe that your professional preferences should override military duty and protocol. They do not. Most importantly, you appear to think that persistence and complaint will eventually wear down our commitment to doing what is right. You are wrong." The photographer stared at her, his mouth slightly open in shock. Around them, the staff members had gone completely still, as if afraid that any movement might draw attention to themselves. "But more than that," the Duchess continued, "your attitude reveals something rather unpleasant about your character. You speak of accommodation and flexibility, but what you really want is for everyone else to compromise their principles for your benefit. You talk about professionalism, but your behavior has been anything but professional." James was amazed by the Duchess's words. She was not just defending his duty, she was calling out the photographer's entire approach and attitude. This was going far beyond the original dispute about whether he should move from his post. Mr. Whitman tried to interrupt. "Your Royal Highness, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No," the Duchess cut him off firmly. "There has been no misunderstanding. You have made your position perfectly clear, and so have I. The difference is that you seem to think your position is negotiable. It is not." The photographer's face was now almost purple with rage. He looked around at the assembled staff members, perhaps hoping to find some support or sympathy, but found only uncomfortable silence. Furthermore, the Duchess added, "Your repeated characterization of Sergeant Mitchell's commitment to his duty as stubbornness, obstinacy, and rigidity reveals a fundamental lack of understanding about what service means. This man has taken an oath. He has been given orders. He is doing exactly what he has sworn to do, and he is doing it with honor. Your inability to appreciate that fact says nothing about him and everything about you." It was at this moment that something in Mr. Whitman seemed to snap. All pretense of professional courtesy disappeared, and his true feelings came rushing to the surface. "Fine," he shouted, his voice echoing off the castle walls. "You want to protect your precious guard. You want to make this impossible for me? Then let me tell you what I really think." The Duchess raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting to hear what the photographer would reveal about himself. "This whole thing is ridiculous," Mr. Whitman continued, his voice rising with each word. "It's a stupid, meaningless tradition that serves no purpose except to inconvenience modern people who are trying to do real work. These guards are nothing but tourist attractions, standing around in silly costumes pretending to be important while the rest of us have to work around their outdated nonsense." The silence that followed this outburst was deafening. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. James felt the words like physical blows, but he maintained his composure, continuing to stare straight ahead with no change in his expression. The Duchess's voice, when she finally spoke, was so cold that it seemed to lower the temperature of the air around them. "I see," she said quietly. "So now we have the truth. You don't simply want Sergeant Mitchell to move for the convenience of your photographs. You actually hold his service, his uniform, and his commitment to duty in contempt." Whitman seemed to realize that he had gone too far, but it was far too late to take back his words. "Your Royal Highness, I didn't mean—" "Oh, but I think you did mean exactly that. the Duchess interrupted. "In fact, I think those words reveal your true feelings more clearly than anything else you've said today." She stepped closer to the photographer, and her voice dropped to a level that was barely audible to the others present, but James could just make out her words. "Mr. Whitman," she said, "you have insulted not just Sergeant Mitchell, but every member of the British military who has ever worn this uniform. You have dismissed centuries of tradition, honor, and sacrifice as tourist attractions and silly costumes. You have shown complete disrespect for the institution of the monarchy and the values it represents." The photographer was now clearly terrified by the turn of events. He had let his anger get the better of him, and had revealed attitudes that were completely incompatible with working for the royal household. "But most importantly," the Duchess continued, her voice taking on an almost ominous quality, "you have shown me exactly what kind of person you are. And I have to tell you, Mr. Whitman." She paused, and James could see that everyone present was holding their breath, waiting for her next words. "The beast does not like you." The phrase hung in the air like a curse. James had never heard the expression before, but something about the way the Duchess said it made it clear that it was far more than just a casual comment. It sounded like a judgment, a final verdict that could not be appealed or overturned. Mr. Whitman stared at her in confusion and growing panic. "Your Royal Highness, I don't understand." "No," the Duchess said, stepping back and addressing the assembled staff members. "I don't suppose you do. Mrs. Patterson, please see to it that Mr. Whitman's services are no longer required. I believe we can find another photographer who understands the difference between accommodation and compromise." The dismissal was absolute and final. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to apologize or make amends. The photographer had revealed his true character, and the consequences were immediate and irreversible. The words, "the beast does not like you," seemed to echo in the spring air long after the Duchess of Cornwall had spoken them. Whitman stood frozen in place, his face cycling through various shades of red and white as he processed what had just happened to him. The assembled staff members remained silent, clearly uncertain how to proceed after witnessing such a dramatic dismissal. Mrs. Patterson, the senior household staff member, was the first to recover her composure. She stepped forward with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with difficult situations before, though perhaps never one quite like this. "Whitman," she said in a tone that was professionally polite but unmistakably final, "I'll need you and your team to pack up your equipment immediately. Security will escort you from the grounds once you've collected your belongings." The photographer looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would intervene on his behalf or suggest that this was all some sort of misunderstanding that could still be resolved, but the faces around him offered no comfort. The household staff members avoided his gaze. His own assistants looked mortified by their boss's behavior, and the Duchess had already turned away from him as if he no longer existed. "Your Royal Highness," Whitman tried one last time, his voice now stripped of all its earlier arrogance and replaced by obvious panic. "Surely we can work this out. I apologize if I spoke out of turn. Perhaps we could—" The Duchess didn't even turn around to acknowledge his words. Instead, she addressed Mrs. Patterson without looking at the photographer. "Mrs. Patterson, please ensure that Mr. Whitman understands that his contract has been terminated effective immediately. There will be no payment for today's work, and I trust that word of this incident will reach the appropriate circles in the photography community." James Mitchell watched this exchange while maintaining his rigid military posture, but internally he was amazed by what he was witnessing. The Duchess was not merely firing the photographer, she was ensuring that his professional reputation would suffer consequences for his disrespectful behavior and his contempt for military service. Mr. Whitman's assistants had already begun packing up their equipment with obvious haste. They seemed eager to distance themselves from their employer's disgrace, and to complete their departure from the castle grounds as quickly as possible. One of them, a young woman who had been quietly setting up lighting equipment all morning, approached Mrs. Patterson hesitantly. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said quietly. "We had nothing to do with Mr. Whitman's behavior. We were just here to do our jobs." Mrs. Patterson nodded understandingly. "Of course. You're free to go, and this incident won't reflect on any of you personally. However, I would suggest that you consider carefully whether you want to continue working with someone who conducts himself in this manner." The assistant nodded gratefully and hurried back to help pack up the camera equipment. It was clear that Mr. Whitman's outburst had not only cost him this particular job, but had also probably damaged his relationship with his own team. As the photography equipment was being loaded back into the vehicles, the Duchess turned her attention to the staff members who had gathered to watch the confrontation. Her demeanor had completely changed from the icy authority she had displayed while dismissing the photographer. Now she was warm and approachable again, as if the unpleasant incident had already been forgotten. "I apologize that you all had to witness such an unfortunate display," she said to the group. "I hope it hasn't disrupted your normal duties too severely." One of the younger staff members, emboldened by the Duchess's friendly tone, spoke up. "Your Royal Highness, if I may say so, I think you handled that beautifully." The way that man spoke about our military traditions was completely inappropriate. The Duchess smiled at this comment. "Thank you for saying so, but I think the real credit should go to Sergeant Mitchell, who maintained his composure and his commitment to duty despite being subjected to considerable pressure and even insults." For the first time since the confrontation began, the Duchess looked directly at James. "Sergeant, you may speak freely." "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," James replied, his voice steady and clear. "I was simply doing my duty as I've been trained to do. I'm grateful for your support, but I want you to know that no external pressure could have made me abandon my post." The Duchess nodded approvingly. "I never doubted that for a moment. Your dedication to your duty, even under difficult circumstances, is exactly what I would expect from a member of the Queen's Guard." James felt a deep sense of satisfaction at these words. The praise from the Duchess meant more to him than she could possibly know, not because of her royal status, but because she clearly understood the true meaning and importance of military service. "If I may ask, Your Royal Highness," James continued, "what did you mean when you said, 'The beast does not like you'? I've never heard that expression before." The Duchess laughed, and the sound was genuinely delighted. "Ah, you caught that, did you? It's something my late mother-in-law used to say. When someone revealed themselves to be fundamentally unpleasant or dishonorable, she would declare that, 'The beast does not like you.' It was her way of saying that the person had failed some essential test of character." James nodded, understanding now why the phrase had sounded so final and ominous when the Duchess spoke it. It wasn't just an expression of displeasure. It was a judgment about the photographer's fundamental nature. The Queen Mother was quite wise about people. The Duchess continued. She had a gift for seeing through pretense and identifying someone's true character. I think she would have approved of how you handled yourself today, Sergeant. Whitman and his team had finished loading their equipment and were preparing to leave the castle grounds. The photographer made one final attempt to approach the Duchess, but two security officers smoothly intercepted him and directed him toward his vehicle. "Your Royal Highness," he called out as he was being escorted away, "this is a terrible misunderstanding. I'm going to file a complaint with your household management. You can't treat people this way just because they're trying to do their jobs." The Duchess didn't even acknowledge his words, but Mrs. Patterson stepped forward to address him. "Mr. Whitman," she said firmly, "I would strongly advise you to reconsider any plans to file complaints or make public statements about today's events. Your behavior was witnessed by numerous staff members, and any attempt to misrepresent what happened here would not end well for you." The photographer's face went pale as he realized that he had no allies in this situation and no way to spin the story in his favor. He had insulted military service in front of witnesses, shown complete disrespect for royal authority, and revealed an attitude that was completely incompatible with working for the royal household. As the convoy of vehicles carrying the disgraced photographer and his equipment disappeared down the castle drive, a sense of calm returned to the East Terrace garden. The staff members gradually dispersed back to their normal duties, and the Duchess turned to Mrs. Patterson to discuss arrangements for finding a replacement photographer. "I trust you know some reliable professionals who understand the importance of working within existing protocols rather than demanding that protocols be changed to suit them," the Duchess said. "Absolutely, Your Royal Highness," Patterson replied. "I have several photographers in mind who have worked with us before and who understand the proper way to conduct themselves on royal assignments. Please arrange for one of them to come in next week." And Mrs. Patterson? "Yes, Your Royal Highness. Please make sure they understand that the Queen's Guard will be present during the session, and that their presence is considered an asset rather than an obstacle. Patterson smiled. "I'll make that very clear, Your Royal Highness." As the arrangements were being finalized, the Duchess walked over to where James stood at his post. She studied him thoughtfully for a moment before speaking. "Sergeant Mitchell, how much longer do you have on your shift today?" "Approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes, Your Royal Highness." "And have you had anything to eat or drink since you began your duty this morning?" James was touched by her concern for his welfare. "No, Your Royal Highness, but I'm perfectly fine. We're accustomed to long periods without breaks." End quote. The Duchess frowned slightly. "Nevertheless, I think you've earned some special consideration today. Mrs. Patterson, please arrange for the sergeant to receive some refreshment without requiring him to leave his post." "Of course, Your Royal Highness." Mrs. Patterson replied immediately. Within minutes, one of the household staff members appeared with a thermos of tea and some sandwiches, which were discreetly placed on a small table positioned just behind James's post, where he could reach them without breaking his stance or appearing unprofessional. "Your Royal Highness," James said, genuinely moved by this gesture. "This kindness is far more than I deserve." "Nonsense," the Duchess replied. "It's far less than you deserve. Today you showed me what real honor looks like, what genuine commitment means, and what it truly means to serve something greater than oneself. Those are rare qualities in any age, and they should be recognized and appreciated." James felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. In all his years of service, he had never received such meaningful recognition for simply doing his duty. "If I may say so, Your Royal Highness," he said, "today you showed me what real leadership looks like. You could have easily ordered me to move and avoided all this unpleasantness. Instead, you chose to defend what was right, even when it was difficult and inconvenient." The Duchess smiled at this. "We all have our duties, Sergeant. Mine includes supporting the people who serve the crown with honor and integrity. Today was simply an opportunity to fulfill that duty." As the afternoon wore on, word of the incident spread through the castle staff. James could hear whispered conversations in the distance, and he noticed that several staff members found reasons to walk past his post, offering respectful nods or quiet words of support. One of his fellow guards, who had come to relieve him early due to the unusual circumstances of the day, approached his position with obvious curiosity. "Mitchell," the guard said quietly as they went through the formal change of post procedures, "the whole castle is talking about what happened here today. They're saying you faced down a photographer and had the Duchess herself defending your right to stay at your post." James completed the formal handover before responding. "I didn't face down anyone, Thompson. I just stayed where I was supposed to be and did what I was supposed to do. Everything else was beyond my control." Thompson shook his head in amazement. "Most people would have just moved when the pressure got intense. Why didn't you?" James considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because moving would have meant that convenience was more important than duty. It would have meant that external pressure could override my commitment to my orders. Once you start making those compromises, where do you stop?" Thompson nodded slowly, understanding the deeper principle involved. "And the Duchess saw it the same way?" "The Duchess understood that this wasn't really about me or about a photograph," James replied. "It was about whether we still believe that honor and duty mean something, or whether everything is negotiable if the circumstances are right." As James walked back toward the guardhouse to complete his paperwork and prepare for his next assignment, he reflected on the extraordinary events of the day. What had started as a routine guard duty had become something much more significant, a reminder that principles still mattered, that honor was still valued, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with the simple refusal to compromise on what was right. The story of the guard who wouldn't move his horse for Camilla's photo shoot would become legend within the royal household and beyond. But for James Mitchell, it was simply the day he learned that doing his duty, even when it was difficult, could inspire others to stand up for what they believed in. And in a world where convenience often trumped conviction, that was perhaps the most important lesson of all. The sun was beginning to set over Windsor Castle as James completed his final duties of the day, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve with honor. But whatever came next, he would face it with the confidence that comes from knowing you have done the right thing, regardless of the cost.